Hello again everybody, and another in my series of talks about classical buildings. We're moving from Greece, where we've had 4 talks about about buildings of different kinds, and now we're going to Rome, to perhaps the most famous of them all. Now, just as the Parthenon is clearly the emblem of classical Greece, so the Colosseum is the emblem for classical Rome. It's instantly recognisable. But not all that many people know how and why it came to be built in the first place. So this talk is not about gladiators or about lions or Christian martyrs, it's not about crowds. It's about the creation and development of what some have called Rome's arena of death. Now, construction began in the early 70s AD, perhaps 72 AD, under the Emperor Vespasian. The place where it was started to be constructed had been part of Nero's Golden House, a space for which had been created by the Great Fire of Rome. If you want to find out more about that, there's an earlier video about the Great Fire of Rome. So Vespasian, the emperor who began the construction, came from the family called the Flavii, and so it was called, the first name for the Colosseum was not the Colosseum at all. It was actually called the Amphitheatre Flavium, the Flavian amphitheatre, and it only later took its name Colosseum from the colossal statue of Nero, which stood outside. Which stood outside the building, outside the amphitheatre. Where did the money come from? Because it's a huge project and it took 7 or 8 years to complete. Well, much of the money that financed the building of the Colosseum came from the sack of Jerusalem and Judea in 70 AD. So another of the ripple effects of history from that most calamitous of military defeats for the Jews. What's it made of? It looks like it's one of those buildings that's made out of brick and colossal blocks of marble. But actually, really, it's a concrete building. And the bricks, which are you can see very clearly, are there to give stability and structure to the concrete. But it's actually the concrete which is the key ingredient. It's the key building material. But what of the big blocks of marble on the outside? Well, some of those are indeed big blocks of marble or big blocks of stone, but quite a lot of the stone, which was originally on the outside of the Colosseum, was just panels of travertine marble which were fixed on to the outside of the brick and concrete structure, the core of it all, by iron clamps. So why is it not covered in marble now? Well, that's because it was robbed of its precious stone, particularly in the Middle Ages. So stone was taken off and used for other things. And doubtless there are a number of buildings, fine buildings in Rome, which have got bits of the Colosseum as part of them, in the same way that there's lots of Northumberland farmhouses are made out of bits of Hadrian's Wall. So it's hard, but when you look at the Colosseum now, it's hard to appreciate what it actually would have looked like then. It's also hard to appreciate quite how big it was, because quite a lot of other stuff has been robbed from it and it has collapsed over the years. So if you go there now, there's a line of marble blocks in the pavement, in the flat surface in the piazza around the Colosseum, which shows the full extent of the building when originally it was there. And it's considerably bigger than the remains of it now. So what we actually have now is more or less the core of it. If you walk right round it, the circumference of the original building is about 550 metres in total. How high was it? Well, originally, at its highest point, it was almost 200 feet high. So it's a very, very high building indeed. It held maybe 50,000, perhaps 60,000 people. So it looked like marble because it had travertine marble clamped on with iron clamps. But in a way, this is like so much of classical Roman building. It looks good on the outside, but actually that masks a core of something cheaper, perhaps more solid, in the same way that Augustus claimed that when he came to power, he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Actually what he did was put a lot of marble cladding on, so it looked much better than actually it was. So when you look at the Colosseum now, you need to imagine that, how much bigger it was, how much brighter it was, how much whiter it was. When you look into the Colosseum now, you can see partly the floor of it has been restored. That was there, and quite a lot of that was there until recently, but Mussolini dislodged that in the 1920s, 1930s. But some of that has now been replaced. But what it does reveal is that there's at least 3 floors below floor level, below the level of the arena, and these were there to house people and animals who were going to become part of the show. And there's a very sophisticated series of lifts and pulleys and so on to allow the entrances and exits of animals and fighters. And archaeologists reckon there are at least 60 of these below floor level. I said this was about a building and not about the people, but you can't get past this moment without thinking of those people and animals who were housed under there with 50,000 people in the seats baying for their blood, just waiting to go out. The stench, the fear, the smell, terrible. So, back to the building above ground. It's a series, think of it as a series of interlocking arches. It's really, really important for the solidity and the strength of the whole structure that it's interlocking arches. It's not post and lintel things like the Greeks used a lot. It's very much the arch, which was a classic Roman thing. But because they interlocked at right angles, it means that the stresses and strains of such a huge building they're dissipated, and it means that the actual impact and the mass is distributed reasonably evenly. There are 80 entrances to the Colosseum, so 80 entrances and exits at ground level, and staircases leading up to the upper levels. There are at least 3 levels, and there were at one stage 4, because Domitian added to the original design. It's like so many stadia these days. You start off with one design, and then like Stadium of Light in Sunderland, you decide it's not big enough almost straight away, and so you add another level, like I suppose has been added to Anfield and Old Trafford at Manchester United too. So there's 80 entrances at ground level, there's 160 gates to different segments of seating, which were called wedges further up. The seats nearer the front were reserved for the upper classes, and there's one section of seats which would be for the sponsors of the games, the editors. Then you get ordinary Roman people, and then in the upper levels, by which time you're going to get sort of wooden benches rather than stone seats. That's where certainly where the lower classes, and then maybe women and perhaps even slaves got to go right at the top. Initially it was smaller, but layers were added by Domitian. Over the top there was a velarium. Now this was a canvas awning which could be pulled over on very hot days, or if it was tipping down with rain. Probably this was manipulated by sailors because they were used to operating the ropes and pulleys. The truth of the matter is we don't actually know exactly how this worked, but there are a number of people who've put forward speculative ideas about how that could have worked, and some of them are pretty interesting indeed. And there's a number of TV programmes and perhaps YouTube videos which explore that a little further. So, some of the questions that we asked about Greek buildings. Is it beautiful? Well, it's hard to think of a building whose purpose was partly death as beautiful. It has a certain symmetry, it has a certain elegance, but I'd be hard pressed to call it a beautiful building. Is it ingenious? Does it solve problems? Certainly it does. In all aspects, how to get people in and out, how to get animals in and out. Does it reflect Roman society? Certainly. It was very much class-based, very rigid. It was built, like Roman society, on intimidation. So it's interesting, coming back to where we started in this talk, to compare the ideas of the Parthenon in Greece and the Colosseum in Rome, and what they say about their respective societies. I'll just leave that thought with you. I'm not offering you an answer. You need to think about that and perhaps look at both these talks side by side.